My name is Nelda Spell Mitchell. I have two books here. The title is Have I Told Y'all This? You have to get volume 1 and volume 2 to get all the stories. It's just things that happened or either I was told about in mine and my husband's life and in our family's lives. We live out in the country from Collins, Mississippi, on a farm. And I just wrote down little short stories that I experienced or I was told about. I'm going to read you one today about I was told about. It's about when 5 men were killed when they were cutting the big timber. Now, whenever our first settlers came, this is a picture of the big timber, how it looked whenever they came. There were big pine trees everywhere on the hilltops and the higher elevation, and there would be hardwood down in the valleys. That's the way they naturally were. The first settlers would cut a small area to make them a field. But then as time went on, in the early 1900s, big timber companies came in from the northern states, and they set up huge sawmills and put little railroad tracks through the woods. They're called dummy lines. Had little train engines were called dummy engines. And they cut the big timber, just cut every bit of it, just about. My grandfather had 5 acres he didn't cut. I'll tell you about that in another story. But around here where we live, and our Dennis's parents lived down the road a little piece. All this area was clear cut with pine trees in the early 1900s. And I'm going to read you what my father-in-law would say numerous times when talking about cutting the big timber. He would always tell this story. He would say there were 5 men were killed on his property when the virgin pine timber was being cut in the early 1900s. All were accidentally killed. One man was killed while riding the dummy train to work. He fell off and was run over by the train that cut his head off. This happened at the Dead Man Cut. That was property that's now owned by the Plum Creek Timber Company, and it's on the east side of Mr. Bury's property. The cut had a double meaning. First, it meant that the hilltop had been cut down, forming a U to make a flat roadbed at the bottom of the U for the dummy line tracks to go, so that their tracks could be more level going through there. So they had cut the dirt to make a space for that, and so it was called the cut. The train cars did not have floors. It was only framing that would hold the logs. The men would catch a ride to and from the woods and sit on this framing. One morning, as the train went through the cut, the man fell down under the train wheels, and it cut his head off. Thereafter, that location is known as the Dead Man Cut. It's still called the Dead Man Cut by our deer hunters who hunt in those woods. Another man was killed west of Mr. Bury's house on what was then the Henry Knight property. several men were cutting a tree that had a big, fat, lighted snag where a limb had broken off about 50 feet up the tree. When the tree was falling, it fell onto a smaller, limber tree. The snag caught and pushed the limber tree over like a rainbow. The snag broke off, and the limber tree acted like a slingshot and threw the snag into the logger's chest and killed him. 3 more got killed in less exciting accidents, and Mr. Bura never talked about the details of their deaths. He would only say that 3 more got killed. None of these men were ever named. Mr. Bura would respond with comments of how unimportant men were, because if a man could not work, there were 9 more standing there waiting for a job. But on the other hand, mules and oxen received the best of care, for they could not be replaced as quickly. There was a big sawmill in the field beside Mr. Bura's house, where it is now, or when Dennis was growing up. At the time, Mr. Bura lived a mile further south. After the sawmill moved, he bought that property and built his house there and lived there. And he worked at that sawmill all the time. They were cutting the timber around here. He started in 1910 working as a sawyer. That means he ran a saw, cutting the trees into lumber. Then he graded logs, and then he was a bookkeeper while all that activity was going on. Now I'm going to show you, this is a picture of a laddered knot. Now this is a big laddered knot. It's lying down here on this shelf, and it's just where a limb was hooked onto a tree. The tree would be going up through here, and the limb would come out this way. And where the limbs would hook onto a tree, there would be a concentration of pine tar. That's the picture of Mr. Bura over there. That's another story. Mr. Bura found his lost and found wallet. I'll go ahead and read that. That's Dennis's daddy, Bura, B-U-R-A. But most people said Bura, Mr. Bura Mitchell. I'll read that one too. It's real short. About 1949 or 50, one winter day, Mr. Bura was riding row by row in the camp house field on a stalk cutter powered by a mule. He was cutting corn stalks to make the spring plowing easier. When the job was completed, he realized that his billfold was missing from his back pocket. He knew it had been in his pocket, and he knew it was lost in the cornfield. The next morning, he walked the cornfield row by row, and he found it after several hours. The way a mule normally walks, it would take 1 hour to plow 1 acre of ground. And this particular field had 8 acres. So it took 8 hours to work the entire field. Mr. Bura always had lots of money in his wallet, several $100 bills plus bills of other sizes. he was a real good man. People knew he had money. He was very frugal. And people would go to him to borrow money or just for a handout. And he was always very generous. Now this field is right beside where he built his house. And the sawmill, there was a sawmill right there, and where his house is, it was all a big complex there, big sawmill, big piles of sawdust were left. I'm going to show you another picture, and I'm going to tell you this. This is pine stumps, and I will tell you about those in another story.